critically analyze all the schemes, techniques, tricks, laws, public edicts, everything that the dominant white society did to socially engineer you into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. You've been sold into it. You have no substantive leadership. The leadership you got right now is totally committed to what they set up under the benign neglect policy, which means let's fabricate all these other groups to take away the benefits that black folks should be getting. Let's give it to them. We'll fabricate new groups and call them fabricated classes. We'll now come up with things called minorities, poor folk, people of color, diversity, multicultural, and gays. Those are fabricated classes. Now, I wrote the first affirmative action plan in 1970 for the state of Florida. When I was over education for the state, I did not write it for minorities. I didn't write it for gays and humpbacks and lesbians and midgets. I wrote it for black folk. So in the history of this nation, they have given up over 1 billion acres of land to whites, free. And that not only they get the free land, but the free land and double and triple in value every 20 years. That's why they got all the wealth. And on that land, all the gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, and timber increased in value. And out of that 1 billion acres of land. And by the same token, they denied giving black folk 40 acres. Forget civil rights. Go back and correct the conditions that you impose on black folk. You cannot deprive a group of people for 500 years of the fruits of their labor for no money, no value, no land, no history, nothing. And they say, go out and compete. Compete with what? And so I tell all my civil rights leaders, you are foolish with the things you keep pushing. Why do you keep telling black folk to go out and fight for equality and equal opportunity? I don't give a damn about no equality and equal opportunity. And here we are, and we buy the garbage every time because we don't understand the issues. Now, so for us, unemployment is the same as it was back during slavery. Why? When I looked at the records, I found out back in those days that in major cities like Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Savannah, that even though you only had 200-some-thousand black folk that were free, all the others, almost 6 million, were enslaved. But yet, what was the unemployment rate? They had full employment as slaves. But out of the 200,000 that were free, guess what? The employment rate for them was still what it is now, almost 35 to 40%. They're sleeping in alleys, sleeping in attics, sleeping on the corners, begging for food, walking, trying to do handyman jobs. The same thing with imprisonment at that time, that even though you only had 200-some-thousand black folk free out across the country, I looked at the incarceration rate, imprisonment rate. But out of 200-some-thousand black folk made up over 51% of all the prisoners. You're the only people that came to this country that were enslaved. Nobody else came here and enslaved but you. You're the only people that were denied the right to vote. You're the only people that were classified as 3/5 of a human being. You're the only people that were classified as special property. You're the only people that the entire Constitution was framed on. You're the only people that holds an entire civil war was fought over you. And more importantly, you are the only and the most patriotic people in America. Nobody in this country, I hear all the people on these Rush Limbaugh types and the Hannitys and the O'Reillys always talking about black folk for this and black folk for that, about patriotism. Nobody in this country is more patriotic than you are. You tell them this, that Dr. Anderson told you this. You are the only people in this country, no Asian, no Arab, no Hispanic, no American Indians, anyone else. You're the only people that have fought in every war this country's ever been in.
A national public policy on black people. Take up the white man's burden 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. The totality of black people's existence and condition in America stems directly from a national public policy designed by white society to control and use black labor to build a new nation. The public policy on the use of blacks developed intentionally until it became like an onion with many layers. It began taking shape in 1619 and evolved into a systematic mandated social arrangement that dictated the behavior of both blacks and whites. The policy's core The policy's core principle stipulated that blacks were to be used as a well-disciplined, uncompensated, subordinated, non-competitive, permanent labor class that existed in the margins of society. The national public policy determined black people's human worth and status, as well as their educational and political opportunities and their cultural and family values. The dominant white society's national public policy explicitly and implicitly defined how blacks were to be treated and used. Public policy is important for blacks to study because it gives clear insight into the process and methods that the dominant society used to establish absolute control over millions of blacks as a laboring class. But equally important, it shows blacks who are seeking to gain power through community organization the way whites constructed a national black public policy and plan. Understanding that plan is essential to the shaping of a new public policy for blacks. The public policy was formulated from racial dogmas and doctrines that justified the policy. The doctrine of racial superiority legitimized the exclusion and segregation of blacks from mainstream white society. The doctrine of non-interference dissuaded governments and social institutions from using their resources and power to stop abuse of black people. And the doctrine of expendability promoted the belief that black life was non-sacred and that there was nothing wrong with using blacks for the betterment and protection of white life. These policy doctrines and dogmas continue to determine the quality of life for whites and blacks in America today. How the national policy on blacks developed. Let's get into it. European culture set the stage for the exploitative use of black Africans, and the social and physical conditions of life in the New World drove the English to construct an aggressive strategy that enslaved them. No single factor compelled Europeans to seek out blacks to serve as the labor class of the New World. Many factors converged simultaneously. The English people, like most Europeans, harbored racist attitudes towards black people long before the first settlers arrived on the North American continent. The European traders and explorers to Africa had brought back stories about the dark continent and its dark-skinned heathens. That's what they called us, heathens, right? The 17th century Anglo-Saxon culture was filled with anti-black terms, and the first English settlers brought their prejudice with them to America. The first 20 blacks entered Jamestown in 1619 on a Dutch warship. Whether or not those blacks were slaves is a matter of interpretation, because the records from that period are scant. But it is reasonable to assume that they were not considered slaves initially. They had been rescued from a Portuguese slave trading vessel by the Dutch warship. They were brought to Jamestown, and the Dutch captain exchanged them for food and ship supplies. If the Dutch captain indebted the blacks in the exchange, it was probably as indentured servants, because records revealed that within 5 years, these blacks were free to buy land, carry weapons, go to court, attend church, and generally socialize with other settlers until the late 1630s. The cycle of black degeneration in American colonies was well underway by the late 1630s. I'm gonna read that again. The cycle of black degeneration in American colonies was well underway by the late 1630s. Labor was critical. No one was valuable to do the back-breaking work. No one was available to do the back-breaking work, not even the free blacks. Word of the terrible work conditions had gotten back to Europe, and whites refused to come to America as indentured servants. Colonial courts and legislative assemblies had begun to enact punitive legislation or rulings against blacks or any whites who consorted with them. As discussed earlier, the Maryland colony set the stage for black slavery in America by issuing a government policy that singled blacks out for subordinate and exclusionary treatment. Based upon available records, scattered incidences of Indian, white, and black slavery were appearing in the Maryland colony as early as 1634. But 4 years later, in 1638, the first public edict or policy against blacks was issued by the Maryland Colonial Assembly. That edict declared that neither the original 20 free blacks nor their offspring shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. This Maryland edict became the founding public policy for the use and treatment of blacks from which white racism, Jim Crowism, and segregation grew later. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, continuing my reading of Dr. Claude Anderson's amazing book, Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. This is chapter 7. I just read the title. Chapter 7, A National Public Policy on Black People. And so in the video, you heard him talking about a policy of benign neglect. And that's basically what we're getting into, what we're reading, how actual policies and laws and the way America was actually constructed. It was built in for black people to be a labor class. It was built in for black people to be, at that time, second-class citizens. It was built in for black people to not be human, to be 3/4 of a human being, for us to not, like he said, be able to enjoy the fruits of the whites. We were to work for the whites, but we couldn't enjoy the fruits of being white, of being free, of being a full human being. It was in the laws, and it set the stage for where we are today. One of the main reasons why Black America is behind, because we were literally brought here to be labor, and laws and policies were set in place to ensure that we remain a labor class, right? Because when you are a labor class, well, and remember, he also talked about making sure that we remain underdeveloped, that we remain depressed, that we remain suppressed, that we remain on the bottom. It is how the dominant society will remain dominant. So this book is laying it all out of how specifically here in America, Black people were intentionally relegated to the lowest rungs of society outside of where the Native Americans are. But we're not far from that. But this book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and Powernomics were both warnings to Black America. This was a Black Labor, White Wealth was a history lesson on what happened to us, how we got here. And Powernomics was a warning to what will happen to us in the future if we don't get our stuff together. And we are in the future. And we do think we got our stuff together because we have more Black individual millionaires than we've ever had. We think Black America is good, but Black America as a whole is hurting economically. Black America as a whole don't own anything. Black America as a whole, we're not unified. We have no kind of collective anything for us to springboard ourselves up to the future, to empower ourselves, to make ourselves better. Like we have nothing en masse. You might have small critical masses of that, but not en masse. You might have certain places, certain cities. Because I know if you live in a metropolitan city, and it depends on where you live in that metropolitan city, you might think that all Black people over the United States live like that. But no. But even if those Black people do live like that, a lot of those Black people do work for organizations that are owned by white people, and they're still enriching the white people. So they're still a part of the labor class. We have been trained when we go to school, have been trained to be a part of the white man's labor class. You have to get an alternative style of training and an alternative style of education to buck that and go against the grain and do something for yourself and your people. That's a whole nother programming. But most of us, when we go to school, we are trained to be a laborer for white people and to exist in these white worlds. That's why we all have been taught how to code switch. That's how we all have been taught how to behave and exist in these specific ways, because if not, then they're afraid that we won't be able to get a job and take care of ourselves, right? But a job in a white man's world, most of us aren't prepared to do for self. Most of us aren't prepared because our parents weren't prepared. If your parents were like mine, your parents would work. It's my mom. My mom worked up until she became disabled, and my pops was just a worker. And at that time, they had those mentalities like, you got to go get a job. And my pops was like, hey, man, you got to work for them crackers, but you got to take care of yourself, right? It wasn't later in life that he was like, man, if you can help yourself, don't work for them crackers. That's how I said. He don't, like I say, he don't say white people, he say crackers. So that's what he be talking about, right? But that's his mentality. Now it changed as he matured. But the idea is for us to be able to, going back to what Dr. Amos Wilson said, our education should teach us to solve our problems. We're being educated to add to the problems. We're being educated to actually become the problem for our community because of the rugged individualism that we're steeped in. Because we don't understand that individual power comes from group power, and we try to mimic the actions and the ways of the white people. White people have been in power in this country since 1619. At least over us, right? Since 1619 over us. It's 2025. That's a long time. Their individual acts reflect their group acts. Their individual power reflect their group power, the same as us. So we can't do what they do because we don't have the group power. We don't understand group power. We've had flashes of it, but we've never had sustained group power or unity that was able to withstand the challenges of white America. Like I was having a conversation with a young lady yesterday, and she was adamant that we are a threat to white people. And she was saying that we are a threat to white people because we have the potential to unify. And I'm trying to explain to her that that's not a threat, but a potential to unify is not a threat to a group of people who go past potential and have the probability, high probability, or the actuality of unifying and dominating. You don't become a threat because you have the potential of unifying. You become a threat because you actually have unified and solidified your unity. You got to know that when your unity is solidified, I'm about to go out, but when your unity is solidified, that's when you become a power. That's when you become a threat. That's when you become powerful. So let me jump back into the reading. I was about to get off from the talking, but let me get back into this reading. This is page 157. Remember chapter 7, page 157, where it says a broad community need shapes the public policy. All right. An abundance of free land and shortage of labor made involuntary labor the key to white survival. Those who owned the largest tracts of undeveloped land could not convert the huge tracts into productive, profitable agricultural businesses without the assistance of a disciplined, strong, expendable, and preferably unpaid workforce, right? Without such a labor force, it was questionable whether the colonies could survive, let alone prosper. Neither Indian nor white indentured servants would do the laborers' work. A bound labor force was the logical solution. A bound labor force. Remember, that's what I said. A bound labor force was the logical solution. The Maryland public edict on black people took greater importance as the colonial settlers realized that they possibly had the key to their common labor problem in the use of black people as their uncompensated workers. The labor problem was resolved in 1665 when all of the existing colonies enacted laws to enslave blacks. The Maryland colony's original edict was expanded into a public policy on blacks, stipulating that black people shall constitute an available, uncompensated, non-competitive, well-disciplined, permanently subordinated workforce, which shall be separate from the white society. England supported the colony's enactment of slavery laws by establishing a full-scale international slave trading industry to provide them with a dependable supply of black slaves. Remember, none of these European nations get off the hook. None of these European nations are our friends. None of these white nations get off the hook, whether from the east to the west, from Asia on over to Europe. Remember that. The primary purpose of forced black labor was to bring whites' newly acquired land to productivity and value by clearing the forest, building the houses, raising the crops, tending the livestock, preparing the food, and raising the comfortable white families. Second, the slaves were to supply England's industries with valuable cash crops and commodities. After the 1660s, all of the colonies had written black enslavement into their statutes. England, as the mother country and the overseer of the colonies, was the first to codify the colony's public policy on black slavery into an act passed in 1667 called the Act to Regulate the Negroes on British Plantations. Besides regulating the slaves trading industry, the act introduced the concept of blacks as personal property and advocated strict and severe treatment of slaves. A doctrine of black expandability was explicitly advocated in this act, which granted white society the right to brand, whip, and actually eliminate black slaves. 4 years later, in 1671, another Maryland act strengthened the public policy by enacting the doctrine of non-interference. This doctrine notified religious organizations that religious conversions and baptisms of slaves before or after importation to North America did not entitle the slaves to freedom, as some slaves had hoped. This non-interference doctrine was later expanded under the concept of personal property rights, which soothed the fears of slave owners who were concerned about losing their investment in any slaves who converted to Christianity. The colonies devoted the next 20 years to perfecting a public policy that defined with mathematical precision what individuals, race, and ethnic groups would be slaves and how they were to be treated. By 1705, Virginia produced a codification of laws applying to slaves called the Slave Codes, which standardized the public policy on blacks as well as white behaviors toward blacks. The codes imbued the public policy on blacks with a new kind of social arrangement and accountability within white communities. It not only established rules of conduct with specified penalties for slaves, but it also implied a code of conduct for all white persons in their relations with blacks. That is important. It set in law how white people were supposed to act and treat the slaves. White people were supposed to know their place, and slaves were supposed to know their place. Not only was a code created, well, not only were laws created for us to be subjugated, but a code of conduct for them was created to behave and to help to continue the system of domination, continue the system of white supremacy. It is codified. It prohibited any white persons from committing any act that elevated the status of blacks or demonstrated leniency in the treatment of slaves. I'm gonna read that again. It prohibited any white person from committing any act that enslaved, It prohibited any white person from committing any act that elevated the status of blacks or demonstrated the leniency in the treatment of slaves. The slave codes were premised in the belief that humility and weakness in the treatment of slaves anywhere was a threat to slavery and that white privilege lifestyle everywhere. So, how to train your slaves, how they should be behaving. If they don't behave in this specific manner, it will compromise our ability to dominate them. They must know their place. They must understand their place. They must be born into the mindset of servitude. They must be born into the mindset of subordination. They must be engineered, socially engineered on a regular basis to understand that Negroes are on the bottom and whites are on top. Negroes are the workers and whites are the recipients and the ones who can benefit from their labor. They should not understand what freedom is. They should not understand what humanity is. They should not understand what freedom is. I said that before, but liberation is not understand what rights are, what true rights are, with having true rights. They shouldn't understand that. They should only understand servitude. They should only understand what it means to be an underclass. They should only understand strife and stress and toxic existences. That is a part of the foundation of the creation of the Black American. That is one of the reasons why we behave the way we behave toward ourselves and each other. It was literally, it's the ingredients that was baked into creating what is now the American Black person, the American Negro. But, you know, for them, that's how they created niggas, because that's what we come out of. We come out of the ingredients to create a nigga. Now, like Big Crit said, I don't want to be another nigga. You know what I'm saying? So it is a reprogramming of ourselves, but understanding the program to reprogram ourselves, because we will no longer be the labor of white folk or any other folk who try to look at us as labor. We will produce for ourselves. We'll be our own masters. We'll be the only ones that reap the benefits of our labor. It's time. So remember, we are behind the 8 ball. We're not gonna lie and act like we ain't behind the 8 ball. We are behind the 8 ball. Now let's talk about how the Civil War modified public policy. By the end of the mid-1800s, the North insisted on change in the public policy on Black labor because Northern workers could not compete with the uncompensated slave labor in the South. The South refused, and the nation went to war. We want to make more money, but we can't make more money because they down there with them Negroes, and them Negroes ain't being paid. And you got more Negroes down there working than us up here working. Them Negroes is outworking us, and they out earning us. And the South is making all the money because the South is making all the money up in the United States. And we got to do something about this, so we got to go fight. The national public policy was in limbo from immediately after the Civil War until the late 1890s. During this time period, the South had no official labor force or public policy on the use of Blacks. Emancipation legally said Blacks were no longer personal property. Newly freed slaves sought to break free of the old public policy. They demanded the 40 acres and the mule that they had been promised and compensation for their years of unpaid labor. Give me mines or else, right? Blacks wanted to leave slavery prepared to be self-sufficient and productive. However, to break free of the old national public policy would require the government to give millions of Blacks unused public land or portions of old Southern plantations for homesteading. For the newly freed slaves to be competitive, they needed quality school systems to help them shake off centuries of forced ignorance, and to protect them from the animosities of the old enslavers and enemies. The newly freed slaves needed legal and police protection, since they were never permitted to bear arms. However, Blacks received none of these things because the national public policy on Blacks as a labor force was unchanged by the Civil War. Both the North and the South had needs for a low-paid, intellectually non-competitive labor force. In reconciling post-war differences, the North adopted the public policy of its southern borders on the treatment of Blacks. There was never any serious effort to give Blacks any measures of economic independence or to compensate them for their generations of unpaid labor. As a Washington, D.C. newspaper noted in 1868, it is impossible to separate the question of color from the question of labor for the reason that the majority of the laborers throughout the southern states are colored people, and nearly all of the colored people are at present laborers. To change Black status as laborers would cause changes in society's political and social ordering of acceptability. Thus, the North and the South collectively agreed to continue but modify the basic tenets underlining the public policy on blacks. The blacks' freedoms were penniless. The black freedmen were penniless, uneducated, homeless, and friendless in the hostile South. Without land reparations or tools, they had little choice except to offer the market their only resources, themselves. As an available, trained, cheap labor force, blacks stepped into a predictable future. The Southern states enacted the Black Codes, which revised the national public policy on blacks, forcing them into sharecropping on Southern farms under the control of former slaveholders. The Black Codes effectively modified the public policy by substituting sharecropping for slavery. It also fixed Black people in a subordinate place in the social order and provided white society with a manageable and expendable labor force. The principle behind the national public policy remained intact and survives to this day. Intact, it remains intact and survives to this day. So, yeah. It's how you set the tone. This is how we will treat these blacks, and this is how these blacks will understand their place. This is how these blacks will exist in society. They have to remain non-competitive. So let's talk about public policy during the Civil Rights era. The latest great change in the national public policy came in the early 1960s and coincided with the Civil Rights Movement, which championed the awakening of Black America during what became known as the Decade of Progress between 1955 and 1965. Blacks won the battle to attend white schools, sit at white lunchroom counters, and sit in bus seats that had historically been reserved for whites only. Little notice was given amidst the celebrating to the fact that the income gap between blacks and whites was widening, and it's still widening. The two societies were growing more segregated than ever. Blacks were losing their few businesses and disposable incomes to white suburban stores, and black unemployment was beginning to skyrocket. That white ice was getting real cold, right? The integration accomplishments of blacks had coincided with the new phase of the public policy on blacks, obsolescence. For the first time in the history of the nation, blacks were free from the society's prescribed labor role. Major advances in technology became the magic bullet that freed the larger white society from dependence on black labor. The two groups' newfound freedoms caused major adjustments in black-white relations. The white society shift away from the dependence on black labor, as noted by Alvin Toffler in his book, Power Shift. Toffler asserted the most important economic development of this lifetime was the use of a new system of creating wealth based on no longer muscles, but on minds. Whites began moving towards a colorblind society where new labor-saving machines replaced the need for black muscles and sweat. Machines were less offensive and threatening. It was unlikely that the new labor-saving machines would champion equality, integration, or civil rights. Instead, new technology provided a bridge from the old world to the new world. Sounds familiar. And freed the dominant white society from its old ways of thinking about race relations, its old ideologies, and its public policies. They no longer need us because they can replace us with the machines and the technology. We're not needed like we were. So that makes us even less of a threat. The new world technology pushed white society into a new public policy for blacks. Few unskilled jobs were left in white businesses and industries. Simultaneously, conservative and liberal white politicians alike claimed that since the civil rights movement had succeeded in giving blacks their social and legal rights, there was nothing else anyone could do for blacks. Blacks were therefore finally free and obsolete. So throw those Negroes out with nothing, and it's on y'all to get y'all's. Whatever y'all do from here on out, it's on y'all, because shoot, y'all want to be free, so here's freedom. Stop asking us for stuff. So this is how the public policy was implemented. 8 major factors appear to have driven the public policy on the use and treatment of blacks across the centuries. So let's get into it. Number one, European colonies were predisposed by their native culture to have negative feelings about blackness and black people. Number two, they established a public edict that was based around a common need that, if resolved, would be beneficial to all members of white society. Three, white society refined and vigorously supported a cohort of public policy on blacks that was transmitted from a generation to generation through laws and social customs. Four, the policy was codified by official governmental acts. Number five, it was concertedly supported by all levels of government, schools, churches, businesses, and the large general society. Six, a sense of community accountability and supporting the public policy was established. Seven, the public policy received total commitment from all segments of the community. Eight, the public policy was continuously promoted and coordinated by institutions and other cities. As a result of these factors, a consensus was reached on how blacks were to be treated. The public policy was expanded and modified incrementally. The adjustment continued over the centuries based upon the broad labor needs of white society. The nature of the modification can be tracked to the same extent by the historical developments of the nation. When new opportunities and challenges demanded human labor in the agricultural fields of the South, the rangelands of the West, the factories of the North, and the military battlegrounds around the globe, the appropriate government or white institutions made sure that the black labor force was available and at the forefront. So, this is also talking about how white supremacy refines itself over time. The adjustments in the codes, the adjustments in the way they relate to blacks, the adjustment in the way, I guess, blacks have access to them or blacks see them. Because racism today isn't what it was 50 years ago or what it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Things change. It refines itself. It doesn't need to be what it was. Black people, we got to remember, right? We're also talking about a time in America where there were only two major racial groups as far as numbers, two major racial groups, black and white. We're no longer in those times. There are other competitive groups of people, whether racial or ethnic groups in America, that are competing directly with us and indirectly with white people, because these groups will classify themselves as white when need be, but they will compete with white people for resources, land, wealth, and power, right? But they will compete with us as well, because we can't just look at America racially as black and white anymore. You have the white race, you have the black race, you have the Asian race, you have the Hispanic ethnic group that can either be black, white, or Asian, right? But the Hispanic groups are usually black or white. But when it comes time for those groups to group up, they would consider themselves Hispanic, right? The black and brown alliance isn't a real thing. So when we're talking about the refinement of white supremacy over time, because America doesn't look the same, white supremacy and racism doesn't have to look the same. Do you have people who still practice the old ways? Yes. You still have people who practice the old ways. But for the most part, you have to ask yourself, why aren't white people treating us exactly the way they did 100 years ago? But the system of white supremacy still exists. Think about it. The system of white supremacy is still alive, intact, and going on. But white people don't treat us the way they treated us 100 years ago. So that made me side-eye everything. Going back to what Muhammad Ali said, you got 1,000 snakes coming at you. 100 of those snakes are non-poisonous and willing to help you out. Do you let all 1,000 snakes in, hoping the 100 will help you, or do you keep them all out? You have to understand what we're dealing with. Just because you got a lot more friendly white people nowadays doesn't mean the system of white supremacy is done. Doesn't mean racism is over. It means it just refined itself. And our conditions are getting worse. That's what we don't understand. We don't understand. Like, we think because black-white relations are better than they've ever been, we're still getting worse. We're still being pushed down by the white race, the Asian race, and the Hispanic ethnicity. We're still being pushed down by those groups. We're still looked at as we can still be seen as a competitor if we actually get our stuff together. But they will make sure that we remain non-competitive. It was built into the policy of white supremacy. It was built into the policy of how black people are to be treated and white people should treat black people, is that we remain non-competitive. The role of societal institutions. All of the societal institutions supported the established public policy for the use of blacks. The churches, schools, businesses, and governments joined in the alliance against blacks. They were parts of a larger societal network that systematically concentrated power, wealth, authority, and resources in the hands of white society and consigned blacks to the subordinated and exploited status. The churches offered biblical justification for black enslavement, denouncing blacks as heathens and bearing the mark of Ham. They preached the doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority and excluded blacks from or segregated them within the congregations. Within the churches, founded by blacks, ministers internalized the conditions, taught blacks meekness and resignation, and the nonviolent strategy for gaining access to their rights and white-owned and white-controlled resources. Educational institutions carried on their essential purposes of servicing the economic ends of white society. They prepared white children to be the leaders and masters of their own fate. White youth were taught academic skills, cultural values, and pragmatic responsibilities of leadership. The schools passed on the doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority to both races. Black children suffered centuries of planned ignorance. During slavery, it was illegal to teach blacks to read. Today, they attend inferior, ill-equipped schools, and our children don't want to read for the most part, especially if their parents have not made reading something normal in the house. They don't want to read. Hell, parents don't want to read. A lot of people don't like reading. That's why we do these readings here. A lot of people don't like reading. I'm encouraging you to read. Go get these books and read them on your own. Please don't just be listening to me read. Please go buy these books. Links are in the description. Hit that like button while you're in the description. Hit that like button because you already know what Joe Biden said. If you don't hit that like button, you don't like black people, right? Hit that like button, but go read these books. Be reading. You have young children. Read to your young children. Read, read, read. American businesses played a role in tailoring the national policy on blacks to their wealth-building interest. They formulated new economic principles of capitalism that defined blacks as human commodities and their labor as cheap tools to produce great wealth. American government functioned as a guardian of white wealth and power. The white society used government power to enhance or maintain their own privileged position and to reduce the societal and economic status and potential of blacks. The government guaranteed white control over the fruits of black labor and control over work process. Government later sustained the inequities by perpetuating the myth of equal opportunity. Once the public policy for blacks was established, all members of the alliance were committed to vigorously supporting it, whatever the cost. A sense of commitment to the policy was a part of the broad sense of white community cohesiveness. Attacks on or violations of the policy anywhere were an offense against the policy anywhere. The South was so committed to its members preferred to succeed the Union and engage in a civil war before altering the policy. We are not giving up our labor. We're not giving these blacks a hand up or a hand out. We're not helping anybody be competitive for us or against us, because we got to remain in power. Bubba, we got to remain in power. So the national public policy on blacks was structured to incorporate the psychological and social conditioning process for blacks and whites that evolved over the course of American history. Slaveholders' abuse power over blacks allowed them to operate an efficient and effective slavery conditioning system. Slaveholders constructed internal controls on slave and minimized the external force necessary to control them. The government provided the environment for the legal framework that allowed the conditioning process to exist and to operate for 250 years. The slaveholders conditioned blacks to serve as good slaves, the effective carriers over into the freed black society, and affected the general behavior of blacks as a race of people. Table 10 indicates some of the major goals, techniques, and strategies employed by the conditioning process that forged a helpless, submissive, and manageable labor force. Helpless and submissive. The process was designed to instill in blacks strict discipline, a sense of inferiority, belief in slave owners' superior power, acceptance of the owner's standards, and a deep sense of slave helplessness and dependence. The slave owners strove to cut blacks off from their own history, culture, language, and community, and to inculcate white society's value system. That blacks are still burdened by the legacies of such conditioning speaks to its effectiveness. Though some slaves resisted the system, worked because the majority of slaves gave passive approval and cooperation to the slaveholder, that in turn made slavery more profitable and permanent. Had slaves been determined not to cooperate and to sabotage production regardless of the cost to themselves and their families, they undoubtedly would have changed the course of history and perhaps spread their descendants centuries of suffering. So we were intentionally conditioned and engineered to be who we are today. We are dependent upon white people for everything. We don't like ourselves. We don't trust ourselves. We don't unify because we don't trust ourselves. We don't codify anything because we don't trust ourselves. We trust everything white, even though the white man subordinated us. Leads to this next thing, because now we understand that the white men are in control. So we want to make the white man feel good and gain the favor of the white man. So here comes meritorious manumission, was the legal act of freeing a slave for good deeds as defined by the national public policy. Meritorious manumission could be granted to a slave who distinguished himself by saving the life of the white master, inventing a new machine, or snitching on fellow slaves. This was a destructive weapon in the slaveholder's arsenal as a powerful component of the public policy. The importance that whites placed on black informants is emphatically demonstrated by a rare movement that the town of Harper's Ferry enacted to honor Haywood Shepherd, a black man who was killed by the totally committed abolitionist John Brown and his raiding party shortly before the beginning of the Civil War. Haywood Shepherd was shot dead by John Brown's party when he recognized John Brown and attempted to warn the town that they were there to free the slaves. And grateful recognition for placing the economic interest of the slaveholders above the freedom of his own people, the town erected the only monument honoring a black man who could appropriately be described as a Sambo. That's crazy. The white man had to kill the black man because the black man was snitching on the white man and his people for coming in and try to free the black people. That's crazy. Since the Black Civil Rights Movement of the late 1960s, the statue has been stored beside the city's major museum and covered in a wooden box. Meritorious manumission was not only used as an instrument to reward blacks, but it was a device for destroying black unity and race loyalty, right? It created a very effective informant system. That's why we still treat each other the way we treat each other. The meritorious manumission policy introduced a strong element of distrust among the slaves and made it more difficult for slaves to organize a revolt. The psychological techniques used were designed to drive wedges between slaves and to train them to trust no one other than the white slave masters. The psychological techniques used were designed to drive wedges between slaves and to train them to trust no one other than the white slave masters. Meritorious manumission was first instituted in Virginia in 1710. According to Peter M. Bergen's The Chronological History of the Negro in America, the technique of meritorious manumission was adopted by all of the colonies. The first use in Virginia of the legislative power to break the bonds of the slave was made in this year, 1710. A Negro named Will was cited for discouraging a slave conspiracy in the colony, and in recognition and reward of the public service, an act was passed conferring freedom upon him. This act of freedom read, "This said Negro Will is and shall be forever hereafter free from slavery, and shall enjoy and have all the liberties, privileges, and immunities of or to a free Negro belonging." The act of freedom restored some of the liberties, privileges, and immunities of Maryland's public edict took from blacks in 1638. The national discipline policy was so successful that in more than 250 years of slavery, there was not one successful slave revolt in North America. Of the more 150 to 200 attempted slave insurrections, in nearly every instance, the slave revolts were prematurely exposed. Unfortunately, the informant in nearly every instance, was a black person. We've been selling each other out since the beginning of time. And they already knew that. That tribalism still runs deep in our blood. Even though we're a whole new group of black people in America, we still have the roots of that tribalism in our blood. And that's why we treat each other the way we treat each other. And it's been played upon and built upon. And the white man is in control of us, has our mind, because they created us to be who we are. And it's time for us to break free. The conclusion of chapter 7. Black Americans have always been a compassionate and caring people. They should continue to do so. But it is now time for them to put their own interests first. If they are to have any chance of changing their negative living conditions, Black America must develop strategies and programs that serve their best interests and allow them to both develop and protect themselves within a society that historically committed harmful acts against them. Until Black obsolescence was reached about 20 years ago, Blacks had limited ability to organize because they lacked capital, leadership, and resources, and they were restrained to an economic system that still had a use for them. Now that Black labor is non-essential and expandable, Blacks as a group are vulnerable and expendable. A national plan for Black empowerment should focus on Blacks becoming politically and economically competitive by acquiring increased wealth and resource power. The greatest challenges to Black America is to do what it has never done before. Through the centuries of slavery, Jim Crowism, and the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power period, Blacks have never had a public policy or racial goals to effectively deal with racism. Instead of an empowerment plan, new generations of Blacks have inherited the vestiges of a failed 1960 strategy. 3 major failings deserve highlighting. First, Black leadership mistakenly believed that by removing Jim Crow symbolism, that racism would effectively die. We didn't learn that recently too, right? Second, they thought integration would make them equal and give them control of resources and power. Yeah, white people gonna give you that. Yeah, all right. Third, they failed to construct long-term institutions with long-term goals that would transcend generational lines and produce a never-ending flow of competent, well-informed new talent. Young Blacks must have a public policy and a plan for direction. All segments of the community, churches, schools, businesses, and community organizations must be involved in formulating and implementing a plan. But the plan must be coordinated nationally by an institute with an intellectual infrastructure. Modeling the methods used by whites, blacks must develop an accountability system to make sure that all blacks support the goals of the plan. Blacks will have to be equally as determined and committed to public policy on black self-empowerment as white society has been to public policy on the use of blacks. Blacks must be willing to apply social sanctions and other penalties against those who violate the public policy for blacks. The Black Empowerment Plan must be based upon a vision of vigorously compelling in a changing world. The plan must go beyond the dream of equality and integration, which hangs, therefore, them like a carrot on a stick. It's been laid out. So we must reprogram ourselves, re-engineer ourselves, reconstruct ourselves, recodify us, actually codify ourselves, and be willing to evolve into something brand new, something powerful, something serious, something respected, something competitive. We have to evolve. We have to work on ourselves, Black people. We have to be better every day. What are we doing to be better Black people so we can push ourselves into prominence? It may not happen in our lifetime, but the better we are, the better our future will be. Black Labor, White Wealth, chapter 7 from pages, it was a short chapter, it was from pages 154 to 172. Pages 154 to 172. Chapter 7, in National Public Policy on Black People. Chapter 8 is Becoming Politically and Economically Competitive in America. That's what I'm talking about, because we got to get it. It's time for us to get it, time for us to do something different, time for us to stop being labeled for everybody else, time for us to stop being consumers for everybody else. It's time for us to stop empowering everybody else's stuff except ours. Are you tired of being on the bottom? Are you tired of being the tissue that all these other groups wipe their ass with? If not, then don't worry about what I'm saying. If you're tired of that, let's do something different. Chapter 8 goes from page 173 to 206. Chapter 8, Becoming Politically and Economically Competitive, from page 173 to 206. Let's make sure we are reading. If you don't have your copy of the book, the link is in the description for you to get your copy of the book. So go ahead and do that. Make sure you click that like button. Make sure you comment, subscribe, and share. You can go to my website at the bottom of the screen. You can go into my description to support myself, Patrick Irvin, Professor Carlton Jones, to support us, and anything else you want to support over here on the Shoulders of Giants. Shout out to my Black History School. Y'all keep striving and shining and being the best versions of yourselves. I'm proud of you, proud of all of you. I'm proud of everybody. I thank everybody for your support. I love you all. Make sure you catch that next video coming up and keep supporting us. Peace out, Ington.